Welcome back. Our next panel may give you some perspective on how vast, complex, and difficult this problem looks from different areas within the DoD supply chain. Now I want to welcome President and CEO of Elbit Systems of America, LLC. That's Raanan Horowitz. He's joining us now live with Cybersheath CEO Eric Noonan and General Spalding. This will be interesting because we're really pulling together unique perspectives in a way that we really hope enriches your view on this problem and the urgent need for CMMC. Now, Eric, we've not yet seen a CEO from a major prime contractor, a policy expert, and a service provider really dive into this together. So that's why I want to start with you here. Can you help us dive into how complex this really is?
Thanks, Julia. It's a great question. It's one of the reasons we put this panel together. So one of the very unique things about CMMC, the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, is the fact that it makes prime contractors essentially accountable for their supply chain. And so in addition to having to secure their own often very complex, geographically dispersed corporate networks, that's a big challenge, and they've got resources to that challenge. But one of the things the Department of Defense has done is to also put the onus of securing their supply chains. And so perhaps a small 20-person metal fabrication shop with 20 employees who does a very specific thing for that prime contractor is now in scope with all these cybersecurity requirements that they have never thought of before. So one of the things that I think is really unique, and I really look forward to hearing from Raanan on this in terms of the supply chain he has to manage. He's in that spot. And Elbit Systems of America has actually done something, I think, a little bit unique over the years in terms of really leaning forward into this problem, because this was a voluntary requirement 7 years ago, and it's only recently become mandatory. But Raanan and team, and it's one of the reasons I asked him to be here today, leaned forward when this was a voluntary requirement and started to address their supply chain in addition to their own infrastructure. And so I'd love, Julie, to hear actually from Raanan in terms of how do you look at this problem? Because you've got the hard problem. You've got your own corporate infrastructure and you've got all your suppliers. And now with CMMC, you've got accountability for both.
Yeah, Raanan, let's go to you now.
Absolutely. Well, it's good to be with you this afternoon. I think really as Eric said, this thing started for us several years back, even before it was mandated in the DFARS or the CMMC. And we actually initially partnered with ExoStar to launch a cybersecurity focused campaign with our supply chain. This was to really address the NIST requirements. What we've done first is go through self-assessment with key suppliers, identified who do we think are the ones that are more vulnerable, and we reviewed their self-assessment. What we found, what was interesting, is as we start diving into it and looking at document reviews and so forth, what we find is that the vast majority of the supply chain doesn't necessarily understand the requirement. And as a result of it, a lot of what we got from the self-assessment was really not very effective or conducive. I mean, some can say it's a misrepresentation. I think it's more associated with really not understanding the requirements. So we've spent a lot of efforts ourselves to really dive in and understand. And really right now what we're doing with the supply chain is actually moved into educating, teaching, making available to critical suppliers our third-party monitoring to really provide them inputs and observation. It's kind of the same thing that the U.S. government is now doing with the prime contractor. We are doing with our supply chain. It's a major endeavor, of course, because the nature of the threat is changing and evolving. The supply chain is changing and evolving, but we believe it's an extremely important element to demonstrate that we have a robust and resilient supply chain, and we can give our customers confidence and trust in what we deliver to them.
Raanan, you just touched on something that I want to go back to there. You mentioned how major this is because the threat continues to evolve. Can you talk about how you work to meet that challenge?
Well, I think a lot of it is how we work with experts outside. So we have some expertise inside the company, but we recognize very quickly that with the type of threats that we have, we need to partner with third-party experts that have the credentials and the background, and also that have the benefit of looking across the industry and across the threats, and can give us that kind of expertise. So we've done that. That's very, very important. We stay very well connected to the U.S. government and to what they provide as alerts. That partnership with both the government and third parties have been very effective to us, both in being more proactive on what we need to do, also in aligning our processes and systems to meet the CMMC requirements as they have evolved, to give us alerts of where we need to do to decide what kind of investment we need to make in systems and in capital. And when the need arises and we need to do remediation and understand if we're exposed or not exposed. I mean, the threats are just enormous. We also use third parties to help us with that.
And General Spalding, I know this is something you'll want to weigh in here, and you probably have a very broad perspective. Can you talk a little bit about your opinion here?
Well, I think it's not always very obvious where the threats come from, and I think this is the biggest challenge for companies, is recognizing that, you know, it's not just where you buy your products. It can also be, you know, who's employed in your firm, and certainly what are the steps that you take to ensure that your employees are acting according to, you know, these kind of security issues. So I think it's one of the things that we find is that you need to take much more of a broad perspective in terms of where the threats come from, and have much more understanding of your environment, and certainly not just your supply chain, but what your employees are doing, and certainly how your security procedures are configured.
Excellent. And I know in talking to Cybersheet that Eric's team works a lot with companies who don't think they're a target. What do you say to that?
Yeah, it's interesting, Julie, and actually picking up on General Spalding's point there, it brings home the complexity of the problem again, because thinking about insider threat, you know, which I think he was referencing, you go back to that small metal fabrication 20-person employer, they're not thinking about insider threat, right? They're probably not even thinking about nation state threat, right? So it's incredibly complex, and you're heaping all these requirements on the entirety of the supply chain, and it's pretty overwhelming. And I think Raanan, you know, alluded to that in terms of the assessment results that he got back as they started to work with their supply chain. So the enormity of and complexity of the threat is incredible. And so given that, and if we're even fortunate enough for those smaller to mid-sized companies to be aware of the threat, and that's a big if, because despite kind of heroic communication efforts, I think, across the Department of Defense and really the government as a whole in terms of education and awareness, there's many companies, perhaps even a majority within that 300,000 plus supply chain who just aren't aware of these things. And so we spend a lot of our time trying to educate companies not only about the fact that they are a target and kind of here's why, and then what they can do about it to try and you know, make themselves a harder target.
And what response have you seen so far from companies when you tell them that they are in fact a target?
You know, it's mixed, Julie. You know, you have you know, two ends of the spectrum, I guess. You have the companies who are kind of leaning forward, see this as a national security priority, recognize their role in being an important, responsible part of the supply chain. And then you have companies who say, and I think sometimes this is almost defensible because they've been hearing about this for years, but it's largely been an unenforced requirement. So you have the companies who did lean forward, took it very seriously, even when it wasn't a requirement. And then you have the ones who said, you know, I may have literally heard it, you know, until the cyber police show up at my door, I don't know that I have to actually go do this. And so I think we've still got a lot of work to do to bring everybody up to the same level of education and then protection.
And Raanan, I know this is something you'll probably want to speak to, as it's now a business issue if an organization does not meet the minimum DoD requirements. Does this make managing cyber risk a board level issue, or were you already managing it at that level?
Well, I think we already do that. We have a very active board committee that is dedicated to security, and originally decades ago, security was more associated with physical security. As we evolved in the last decade and a half, it became more about electronic communications, and then information technology and information technology systems, and cyber is a very key element of the agenda for the security committee of the board. It's definitely something that's very high on our priority and attention. We do that all the time. Also, the whole discussion with regards to how we deal with the supply chain and how do we look at the supply chain is also an issue that we report to the board on a regular basis. It's a very major focus for us. One thing I wanted to maybe add to what Eric was talking about with regards to the awareness in the supply chain. I just want to highlight, the cybersecurity risks are not just associated with theft of IP or with technical data. And sometimes companies think, well, what do I have that somebody wants to steal? I don't think that's the only thing. I mean, there is employee information, personal data, various other things where companies can really find themselves in a very significant liability, violation of laws in a situation that actually can be existential for a small company if they get penetrated. There's a lot of news in the last few weeks about an increase in ransom attacks on both private and public organizations. So I think that this is becoming more and more important. I think there is growing awareness of it. I think that when I'm talking to our suppliers and our customers, it's definitely something that's getting to be more important to them.
And General Spalding, do you want to weigh in there?
Well, I mean, it's clear that we're going to have to do something. One of the issues, for example, that we face is the loss of dominance in semiconductor technology. And in fact, the Chinese Communist Party is investing billions of dollars, and they're working hard to, encourage whatever company that's out there to help them, attain that. And there's other technologies they seek to gain. It's all in a policy, a number of policies. One is Made in China 2025. Another is a medium and long-term technology policy. These programs are all designed to incentivize Chinese companies to work with U.S. companies to acquire technology and bring it over. But, it's also about creating challenges to our own industrial-based supply chain in terms of threats to our own equipment. So it is a very, very big challenge. It's a big challenge for the companies that represent the industrial base. And quite frankly, it's an overwhelming resource drain on their business. And so, one of the reasons why I'm such an advocate of decoupling from China and getting them out of our system is because that ability to secure our supply chain is almost impossible, quite frankly, today, in the way when you have a fully functioning Chinese Communist Party in our economy and able to move about in the way that they can, securing, from insider threats or cyber threats or social engineering that we see every single day is nearly impossible if the Chinese Communist Party is intent on getting some piece of technology or disrupting some military component. Big challenge.
Well, can you talk a little bit more about that? Can you really paint a picture for us as to how China might exploit these kinds of companies to weaken our national security?
Well, I'll just give you, so one of the vignettes that I talked about was a major manufacturer of electric grid technology. And in fact, if you look in the United States now, it's able to supply about 15 to 20% of its main electrical grid components. The rest are mostly sourced from China. This company had It was doing research, global research. It had 3 research centers that was uploading its research, I believe, on a quarterly basis. What happened with this company is that they had a transfer of roughly $800,000 out of the company. Now, that's not a big amount of money, but it did cause them to bring in auditors to find out what had happened. So what they found was that in one of these research centers, when they uploaded to the main server, the company server, they had some vulnerabilities. What was happening was the Chinese were exploiting that vulnerability. They were coming in, they were taking that data as it was being uploaded, and then what they would do is have a much more visible hit to the server. What the company's policy was to take that server offline, to wipe it, and then essentially rebuild it and put it back online. And the behavior would happen again and again. Now, what was happening was they weren't recognizing when the data was being taken, but they were recognizing it when the Chinese wanted them to recognize it. And this was causing them to wipe the server, which was basically wiping away the evidence of what had happened. So somebody in the system had gotten greedy to transfer the money. This was probably some kind of insider job. In other words, the People's Liberation Army, one insider was probably taking some money for themselves, and the entire thing got exposed. What happened to this company is that its entire product line, its entire product catalog, its entire sales list was recreated in a new company in China. And in fact, all of the R&D that this company was doing actually led to patents for this new company in China. And just before this company, this US company introduced their latest product, literally a month before they announced it to the world, the Chinese company announces the exact same product patented in China using Chinese technology. And so what they found was this new company in China was rapidly gaining market share away from this top company in terms of this technology. And so what it was not just the stealing of intellectual property, it was a stealing of the entire business away from a company that was, prior to that, doing quite well and leading its industry. So it is a multifaceted threat, quite frankly, that, this was a very big company. You can imagine small companies, if they're up against it, the challenges they face in terms of trying to protect themselves from what was a very, very sophisticated attack.
Now, when you talk about the need then to decouple ourselves there from China, what are the top 3 things America needs to do to strengthen the cybersecurity of our defense industrial base supply chain?
Well, I would say in terms of cybersecurity, the number one is to create a nationwide secure network that not only government, but also companies and individuals can use. Now, we can have continue to use the unsecure internet, but certainly if you're a company that relies on, intellectual property or the protection of your data, which is almost every company, then it would behoove you to be on some kind of secure network. That can easily be mandated by the government and built, and unfortunately we haven't done that. And the other ways that we need to protect ourselves, I stated them earlier, we need to continue to have tariffs that allow our companies to reshore manufacturing and really be competitive on a cost basis in doing so. And then the other is to ensure that they have access to capital. One of the biggest challenges for American companies today is they can't get access to capital because most of the capital is actually flowing into China to promote, the development of industrial-based companies in China. So access to capital, permanent tariffs, and a secure network for the industrial base in the United States, I think would go a long way to helping companies fight this challenge.
Raanan, would you agree with that?
We have decoupled from China quite some time ago. So we don't use anything from a supply chain from them. We had, in one case, actually in commercial aviation, we have won a position on the COMAC 919. Without going into details, this was not necessarily a cybersecurity issue, but there was a different attempt to try and gain access to our IP and the technical data, and we basically pushed back, and as a result, ended up being removed and actually gave up this contract and gave up the participation in this program because it was more important to us to protect our IP, to protect our position. We're a world leader in what's called enhanced flight vision systems. It's all equipped on Gulfstream aircraft and Federal Express and Dassault and others, and we decided that it's better to give up the opportunity in China in order to protect our market share. And of course, a couple of years later, showed up a different system that from the outside looked like ours. I don't know what's inside, but I don't think that they gained access to our information. So I think it's a choice. I understand, as the General was saying, is that the Chinese market may be a big market, but those of us that are involved in national security and national defense, I think, have to make a choice, and we have made that choice.
And Eric, you've really seen every side of this equation. Do you want to weigh in here?
Well, those are great points by both General Spalding and Raanan, because I think the decision has largely been made for the defense industry, and we've seen it with some regulations earlier this year around Huawei and some other things that the Department of Defense has enforced upon the supply chain. So the decision has in some ways been made for our supply chain in terms of decoupling with China, and the great risk you are taking, and I don't even know if it's guaranteed risk really, I think over a period of time, because eventually whatever the short-term economic advantage of potentially doing business there is probably going to be overcome by some challenges to your business. And I think both said it in different ways. It really is an existential threat to a business, because a large business can potentially absorb that kind of intellectual property theft, but a smaller business can't and could absolutely be wiped out. And so, having been a global CISO for a large defense contractor, I've seen it from the big prime perspective that had resources to marshal and address the threat. And now working with the DoD for the last 12 plus years to see this come from a voluntary set of requirements all the way through a mandatory regulation that, granted, it's taking some time to flow down through the supply chain, but I think directionally where the Department of Defense is going and mandating these minimums is the right direction. And then finally, as a service provider here at Cybersheath and working with large primes and small businesses to meet the requirements, I think having those three perspectives, what I've come away with is to recognize it's very, very different in terms of how each of those constituencies address the threat. And I think Raanan mentioned it. It requires partnership. I don't care how small you are or how large you are. Cybersecurity and the controls required to be effective when you're battling nation states, no one company has all that expertise. So it really is a team sport.
Now, when you're working with your clients, Eric, how long does it take and how much does it cost, would you say, for the average company to really meet all these requirements we're talking about?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's one I get daily. And so usually it's something like, I have to do the CMMC thing. How much is it going to cost? And it's kind of like saying how much to build a house, right? It depends. It depends where you are. Every company's at a different stage of maturity. Every company is at a different level of awareness in terms of what the requirements are. And at a small business, often, if they have an IT capability in-house, they're ahead of the curve, but almost never have dedicated cybersecurity. So costs are all over the map. It depends really where you are. And that then ties into how long, right? There is one of the great things I think about the current requirements of their maturity framework. So they are not a compliance framework where it's a checklist. And so there's very much a maturity curve laid out for companies and what they need to do. And I think the controls are very much geared towards basic hygiene. And so moving up that maturity curve and how much that'll cost really depends. There's no stock answer. I wish there was, but it really depends where you are, the resources that you have in-house, and then how much partnership you have to do with third parties. But the takeaway that I'll leave that is to say it's certainly achievable for that 20-person metal fabrication shop to the large prime. This is a solvable problem, but it requires executive focus. I think that the number one attribute that I've seen consistent across companies who address this effectively is executive level leadership. If you have that, you will get there. If you don't, you won't.
And Raanan, I know that's something you can speak to as a large prime contractor. Can you really speak to the importance of leadership and what that means in this world we're living in now?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I think maybe just maybe add a little bit to what Eric was talking about, the cost. I think the biggest selling point, and I think it's so hard to do, is that the cost of remediation is probably orders of magnitude more than the cost of being proactive in protecting the systems. And so I think that goes right for a lot of other domains, but again, I think it's important to remember that and to work that. So it does require, to prioritize, because we all, companies like ourselves, want to invest money in growth initiatives. We want to invest money in R&D. We want to develop new products. And many times it's hard to go back and say, let's go invest the money in protection of infrastructure, cyber, or other things. And so it does require both the board and leadership to really be conscientious of this and push forward and make sure that we do that. I think one of the other elements that I'm finding one of the biggest challenges, because it's not just the systems and the IT systems, it's also the overall issue of how do you segregate your data, how do you mark your data, how do you define which data needs to be protected. That, by the way, goes directly into the issue of insider threats. And many times insider threat is not necessarily people that are want to do intentionally harm to the company. It might be just people that are just not aware of the sensitivity of data. I've had some discussions on that with the administration, with DoD. I think there are attempts to codify a better, easier system to mark data and to define what is sensitive, what is more sensitive, what must be protected at all costs. I think that's one of the biggest challenges, I think, for everybody to really understand that, because you talk about a lot of data that companies have, a lot of data in the supply chain, and a lot of data that has to be managed. So the whole issue of data loss protection and prevention is a major endeavor for companies like ourselves and for the supply chain.
Now, how much work goes into differentiating those threats?
Well, I think we still are worried. So it's not so much differentiating the threats, it's differentiating which data is sensitive, why is it sensitive, how do you protect it? So it's a protection of the data going outside the company, but when you talk about insider threat or insider, you also have to decide who in the company should have access to what data. That's part of the overall scheme. So it's not just the perimeter of the organization to the outside, it's also what do you create, what kind of compartmentalization you create inside the company to make sure that data is accessed only by people that really need to have access to the data. And you don't create a future vulnerability when somebody leaves the company or any other situation. It's a major endeavor, and it is an ever-evolving, changing situation.
I want to go back to the leadership question quickly here, because I know, General Spalding, that's surely something you can shed some light on. What advice would you give to leaders in this position that are dealing with these changes and these new requirements?
Well, the first thing I would say is don't expect the Department of Defense to have all the answers. In fact, you probably have more answers than the Department of Defense. The truth is, we struggled with this when I was at the Pentagon. I know they're struggling with it now, trying to wrap their arms around the challenges that industrial partners face. I think it's more important that you're proactive as a leader of your company to basically take a look around and anticipate what those threats might be. Because if you're waiting for the government to come and tell you, well, this is a problem or that's a problem, then I can tell you you're always going to be caught flat-footed. You don't want to be flat-footed. You want to be on your toes. You want to be prepared. And the way that preparation comes is by anticipating those threats before they come and really putting in place a lot of procedures and awareness in your people that the challenge exists. Government is not going to solve that for you.
Eric, do you feel the same way?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think tying those two viewpoints together, there's a lot there actually. And so awareness and understanding your assessment, really. I mean, it all starts, it's a theme of this event, right? Assess, implement, manage. It starts with that assessment piece and doing an assessment against the compliance requirements and your risk so that you understand where to start. And then I think that assessment directly ties to understanding your data, because the number one thing you can do to lower your cost for compliance and frankly for cybersecurity in general is to understand your data. It's also coincidentally the hardest thing to do, right? Is really understanding your data and knowing, if there's 110 security requirements of NIST 800-171, they only apply to certain data sets. So if you're peanut butter spreading these controls across the entirety of your infrastructure, it's a very expensive and ineffective way to deploy cybersecurity. So the number one thing that you can do is start with an assessment against the controls and understand, if you really want to reduce costs, it truly is understanding your data and understanding what your controlled unclassified information is. It's much more difficult to do than it is to say. And I think it's the long-term challenge, because this is a bit of an arms race, and you can't protect all data equally, because eventually you'll run out of resources to do that and you'll miss something important. So I think that assessment of your infrastructure and your data, your people, processes, and technology to understand which data you have to protect and which controls you need to employ to protect that data, that really is foundational.
You're touching now on my next question for Raanan, which is, many subcontractors in the supply chain don't have the budget, don't have the resources available to a larger prime, and may need a third party to help them along this journey to full compliance, right? So what advice would you give to these suppliers for vetting a third party to help them close this compliance gap?
I think, first of all, my number one advice is look for somebody who's going to partner with you for the long run. It's not just a vendor. You don't just buy, a monitoring software package or stuff and put it on. You need to really partner with somebody who's invested in this. My advice is ask for references, ask for credentials, and look for somebody who has the expertise. Definitely engage in that dialogue, and if somebody's telling you that they can fix everything very quickly, or that you're going to have 100% assurance that you're not going to be vulnerable, then that's a red flag, because we all understand the threats are evolving, and so there has to be a continuous effort and a continuous improvement on that. It's not a one-shot solution. That's what we have done, and I think that's my advice to others. Look for that long-term relationship with a partner that has the credentials, that cares about cybersecurity, that is recognized in both the industry and the government, that has the expertise, and is willing to go with you along with when it's good and when there are difficulties.
You mentioned that red flag there of someone who promises they can fix it for you at one stop. What other red flags would you look for?
Well, again, the red flag is maybe not fully understanding or not representing that it's a continuous effort, that it's not a one-time solution, not realizing that no one, and I really believe that, unless they completely disconnect themselves from the outside world, and even that is difficult, can give you 100% assurance. Therefore, it has to be a combination different things. And both Eric and the general talked about the self-awareness of people. We found, and it's the true thing about security anyway. I mean, you can't guarantee security just through systems and processes. You have to have the workforce with high level of awareness, to high level of attention, in combination with good systems and good processes. So I would look for a partner that understands it's a multidimensional problem and it needs to be dealt with across all of those domains. The IT systems, the data marking, the employee awareness, the continuous monitoring, the processes. It's all one combined system.
And General Spalding, would you add anything to that list of credentials that you would look for in someone to work with you on this?
I would just make sure that the whoever it was had experience in this area and was a true professional. You don't want any on-the-job learning here. You need somebody that is up to speed and can really help you assess and then implement some basic protections right away, so that you're not kind of learning as you go. It's not a place that you want to implement learning as you go.
And Eric, at Cybersheath, how do you monitor the credentials that are necessary to help these companies achieve this goal?
Well, we try and be humble about the fact that we don't have all the experience, right? And to, I think, Raanan's point earlier, that it really does, you have to understand, we're not data marking experts. I can't tell a customer what their CUI, controlled unclassified information is. I can't tell them whether they may generate that on certain projects. They bring that expertise to the table. So I think, to put it maybe a little crudely, is this is really a managed disease. I mean, the good news is it can be managed. The bad news is it's not going away. And so it really isn't about compliance as much as it is long-term, managing this problem and trying to reduce your risk. It's like, going on a diet a couple days before you go have your cholesterol checked, right? It's just not going to work. You have to implement long-term solutions, and you really do have to engage your employees, whether you're that 20-person metal fabrication shop or you have a couple thousand employees geographically dispersed. They need to be brought in and part of that solution. And it's critically important, because regardless of the technology, and I think that's one of the things I'm most optimistic about, actually, is these conversations, I think a decade ago, were very technology focused. Buy this product, be secure. Buy this software, deploy it, solve the problem. It's not that anymore. It's really pivoted, and I think there's a level of candor, and I think you heard it today, around this is a problem, and you're probably not going to solve it 100%. There's no such thing as completely secure. And I think the realism that's crept into the discussions around this problem over the last decade is refreshing, because I think that when we can address this candidly and recognize there is no silver bullet, and that it's as much a people process problem as it is a technical problem, I think then we have a chance to win. So I'm more optimistic in terms of the tone and the way this problem's been discussed about in the last several years than it was 10 years ago. I think it's less product focused, less buy this, do this, transactional, and more of an understanding that this is a long-term strategic problem to be managed that requires smart partnerships and all three elements of the solution being people, process, and technology.
When you talk about people and you talk about the importance of engaging employees, I'm curious to hear your perspective, Raanan, on how you work to do that at your level. How do you engage your employees to make this a successful mission?
Again, it's across different domains. So we invest a lot of effort in training. We continue to talk to our employees about that. We basically do mock training. I mean, we do phishing exercises internally on a regular basis and look at the statistics and provide feedback to people. The overall issue of data and understanding what's sensitive or what's not sensitive, I think all that is very, very important to make people aware of that. We talk to people about what they need to watch for. We explained, I think one of the key things these days, and interested maybe in Eric's point of view, I mean, with the remote work as a result of the pandemic, definitely opened up a whole new set of vulnerabilities with employees, using equipment at home, using their own networks, all that, the connectivity issue, what you can talk over different, video conference medium and what you can't. I mean, all that is becoming very complicated. So it's a continuous effort to educate and to explain and to look for additional vulnerabilities.
Do you want to speak to that, Eric?
Yeah, I mean, really think about that, right? In the last, whatever it's been now, I'm losing track, right? 10 months, whatever the count is, all the investment footprint that historically had been put into corporate enterprise infrastructure around firewalls and data loss prevention and all the tools to protect the facilities and networks that were largely physically located in corporate offices. That entire model and investment is still there, but all your resources left. All your resources are now in places that you hadn't thought to make that investment before. And so now employees are working from home on disparate networks. And in many cases, we've seen a lot of customers have to make that huge shift to make sure now the data is still flowing through those corporate networks to get the advantage of all the investment that have been made over time. And so whether that's through kind of VPN technology or other technologies to make sure that the data, because again, it's about the data, still flows through a controlled or somewhat controlled communication channel. But that's been a huge shift, right? And it was one certainly no one predicted. And now it actually, I think, highlights the importance of the fact that you have to understand your data. Because if an employee who is working from home is doing something that's transactional, that doesn't interface with what we consider important data, controlled unclassified information, if I can understand that employee's scope and the access to data that they have against somebody who's working from home on sensitive but unclassified data, I want to treat those two things differently. And I don't think we've figured that out yet, particularly now that we aren't all going into the office anymore. So we had that workforce all kind of centralized, and frankly, it was a little bit easier to make those enterprise level technology investments. But now that's all been dispersed, right? And it's forced us to change our thinking a little bit. And naturally, you've seen kind of the marketing hype around that from product vendors around what you need to do. But I always come back to the people and the process side of the equation, because I think that can often be as impactful as the technology side of the house.
And it doesn't seem, I mean, to your point, we're all working from home now, and it doesn't seem that's going to change anytime soon. So General Spalding, I'm curious to hear if you have any thoughts on this shift that our country is now facing and how this might change things.
Well, it comes back to that, that paper that I wrote when I was at the White House, and really just stressing the need for essentially an industrial internet for the United States that enables us to, roam wherever we want within the country, but still be within the framework of a secure encrypted network. And so this is not something that's not the way that we've thought of national security traditionally. It's been, we go abroad to fight, and in reality, the fight's been brought to our shores. And we need to take a much more proactive view in terms of national security and how we treat data in this country. It should not be left to the individuals, the citizens, or the companies on their own fighting nation states that have all the resources of a nation state, and they're bound to determine to get in and take that critical data. So we have to think differently about national security. This is a national problem. It's not just a industry problem. It's not just a company problem. It's not just an individual citizen problem. This is really what the country, the government, our federal bureaucracy was designed to do, to protect the society. We protect the land, the space, the sea, the air, but we don't protect the most crucial resource of the 21st century, which is data. And unfortunately, DoD, in all its money that it spends and all of the things that it does, it's more focused on protecting its own data than the data of the country. And that's a wrong way to think about protecting our democracy in this day and age.
So you're touching now on my next question. I was going to go back to Eric's point now with just over 10 minutes left. He mentioned he was optimistic about the future. You don't sound as optimistic, General Spalding, or am I incorrect?
Well, I mean, I'm optimistic that we can easily see the challenges that face us. What I'm not optimistic about is coming together and actually dealing with those challenges. We are so focused on what we traditionally think are the threats to this country and how we should address those threats that we're completely missing what our main adversaries are going after. They do not want to meet us on the battlefield of the 20th century. It would be suicide for us or the Chinese to think of direct conflict. So what they seek to do is undermine us from within. And one of the easiest ways to do that is to influence or interfere or abscond with our data. And unfortunately, we just have not realized that. The first ones to recognize the importance of data, I dare say, were the authoritarian regimes. They recognized that their society was vulnerable to outside influence. And so the Chinese built a great firewall. The Russians, have figured out how to unplug from the global internet. We, at the same time, are just sitting here basically open to attack, and we haven't really done anything about it. And so unless we act, I mean, it's clear that we can see it. Unless we act, though, to do something about it collectively as a nation, then we're not going to be able to meet the challenge.
Raanan, do you have a response to that, or are you optimistic or less optimistic?
Well, not necessarily a response. I think I see reason to be more optimistic, and I'll say a few factors in that. One is the Department of Defense has demonstrated strong will and leadership around this, and I applaud the efforts around CMMC and pushing that forward. So we've seen in the last 3 years, we've seen a significant shift in understanding that's important. So that's, as the General said, this is the role of government, and I think that they're recognizing and moving forward. That's number one. I would say number two, with regards to people awareness, I think the workforce, the country, the individuals these days have much higher awareness of the risks. And the reason why is because we are, as individuals, are exposed to some of the same risks, maybe not in terms of stealing IP, but stealing identities and stealing money and ransom attacks and so forth. So individuals are much more aware. I think that's going to play into the future. The other thing that I think is important to think of what's going to happen from a technology perspective, and I'm not talking about the IT technology and the protection, but one of the best ways to protect intellectual property and IP and data is to evolve it very quickly, so that by the time it gets stolen or lost, it's already less important because you've already evolved it to the next level. And that's one effort that the Department of Defense, a lot of us in the industry are really working hard to speed up using digital engineering tools and agile software and capabilities to speed up the development cycle such that by the time somebody might get their hands on it, it's already obsolete. It's already the older version. There's other factors, but I think there's reason to be optimistic, but cautiously optimistic. I wouldn't say that it's a sure thing. I think we still have to do a lot of things in order to make sure we are protected.
Eric, would you agree with that?
Yeah, I'm hopeful that speed is one thing. I mean, Raanan touched on that in terms of the speed of the evolution of the data and potentially making it obsolete by the time the adversaries have it. But I'm also hopeful speed in terms of the process of bringing this to bear. So in the last 18 months, I mean, really this has been at least a 12-year journey for the Department of Defense, and going from voluntary to mandatory but self-certification in 2015, and then it made 2017 the deadline, quote unquote deadline, but it was still again self-certification, to now where we are today, moving towards, over the next 5 years, mandatory independent third-party verification of commercial defense contractor networks meeting compliance requirements. Now, that's 12 years, so from a speed perspective, it took a long time, but it's a pretty transformational step, right? We've now seen the mechanism of government come together and find a legal way to go and audit commercial defense contractor networks as a condition of the opportunity to do business with the Department of Defense. That's a transformational change. So I think it is cautious optimism, and I think we have 12 years of bipartisan, largely progress and agreement on this problem to look at and say, we can actually do this. We've got the brain power to do it. We've got the the legal mechanisms in place to do it now, and we're getting the will of industry. I think the primes are largely there. The small companies, small and mid-sized, have a long way to go, both in terms of education and actually making progress. But they will follow. And so I think cautious optimism's the right word. And I think there's a recognition. I think General Spalding talked about this. I won't have the statistic exactly right, but earlier today when he talked about the money spent, in traditional kinetic warfare versus what we could do with those resources to address this kind of a problem if we weren't spending them on traditional war. And I think we're moving, hopefully, more towards understanding that and understanding the value of data, and that's where the investment needs to be, both in terms of innovation, as Raanan says, and on the protection side. So, yeah, it's not a sure thing, but it's I think we're on the path.
We have about 4.5 minutes left. General Spalding, I want to give you a chance to respond to that.
Well, I agree. I mean, I think particularly in the last since the first quarter of 2018, when the National Security Strategy came out, we have really enacted a lot. We've moved a lot, even in the last 12 months. So it's accelerating. So, I guess I would say I'm cautiously optimistic, but again, with an emphasis on the cautiously, because we can't rest on our laurels. We can't stop. We've got to keep accelerating, keep going forward, and really focus on what is a true threat to our democracy, which is, our ability to protect our digital infrastructure and our data.
And Eric, I'm going to toss it back to you now with just over 3 minutes left. Is there anything that we're not touching on here that you think needs to be talked about before we go?
I think just actually the one piece, and it's implied, I think, in this panel and in this event today, is the ability to have these discussions. I mean, this wouldn't have happened. I mean, I just remember, I think it was 2008, the Google Advanced Persistent Threat attack. They were kind of the first company that came out and admitted the vulnerability and admitted the fact these things are happening. And now 12 years later, I mean, these conversations are much more routine. So just the fact that a panel like this can be put together and can have an honest dialogue about this problem, I think that's something that I would highlight as critically important, whether it's here, whether it's within a company, within the supply chain and the suppliers to a company. These conversations, I think, are so important. And I think venues like this and others are critical, because there's a lot of people that, frankly, don't have the expertise, the knowledge, or even understanding of the threat. And so there's a lot of work that has to be done in conversations like this, I think, are frankly helping to forward the ball down the field.
It goes back to what you were talking about, Raanan, with that awareness, that level of awareness that you are optimistic about. And we have about 2 minutes left here. I'm curious to hear from you, Raanan. What does the future look like to you?
Well, from a perspective of cyber, I think the future looks ever more complex. That's the honest truth. I mean, it's going to be more complex. We're moving into more work on the cloud. When we talk to the government, they're talking about government cloud and multiple developers, third parties developing systems on that cloud. So we're talking about the digital transformation that I mentioned. So everything is digital, and again, that all says massive amount of data, massive amount of systems that are connected. There's discussions nowadays about doing classified work again remotely, not just through the regular network, but using different kind of system to enable at the secret level, at least, to do things remote. So the future to me looks more and more complex, which is a good reason to have to work with partners, with capable, reputable, experienced partners, to stay very close to the customers and understand their needs and their requirements, and as you mentioned before, leadership and vigilance by the workforce.
We have 45 seconds left. General Spalding, do you want to weigh in on your future thoughts?
Well, again, it's going to take us all working together, and I do think that the government and industry is going to have to come together and cooperate and collaborate, and certainly in and amongst companies, sharing best practices, sharing like was talked about Google and the APT that face them, sharing what the threats that they individually witness. It's by collaborating that we're going to get over this, and that's really the only way.
Excellent. And we have 10 seconds left here, so I want to thank all three of you gentlemen for being a part of this panel, and we hope to continue conversations like this in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us.